He looked to the heavens when he heard the engines hum. A sky full of planes and each one with a bomb. And they're gonna wanna drop them on someone. It's 5 to 7.
Well, greetings. Welcome to everybody that's listening to this Ireland at War podcast from myself, Keith Pengelly, and also from Nick Lahiri. Hi, Nick.
Hi, Keith. How you doing?
I'm doing very well. So we've had a run of specials in the last few weeks, but we return now to the month-on-month accounts of the occupation of the bailiwick of Guernsey during the Second World War, 1940 to 1945. So what we're going to do is we're going to jump straight into reports that are in local media of the time, Nick. Rationing obviously was starting to dig deep into daily life then. I see a new producer, wonderful advert here. Beef rations had run out, but pork was available. And I think also there's some other things that were in short supply then.
Yeah, so we're in February 41 and there's already severe problems with food. As we talked about in previous podcasts, it started much earlier than this, but things were really starting to cause massive problems. So the notice that I've got here is actually about pig rationing, which says breeding sows due to a farrow will be allowed an extra £10 of mash per week for 1 month before and 1 month after farrowing. Owners of such sows must register same with this board at the date of drawing first ration. And that was really because they wanted to know exactly who had what. They'd gone round the farms and done surveys, but they just wanted to make sure that people didn't have any unreported pigs, which they most certainly did in some cases that I'm aware of, which may have gone missing.
Yes, and this advert seems not only to be telling the farmers what they already knew, but it seems to be telling the general population that there was a high degree of control over this, possibly to stop black, or trying to assuage fears of a black market, etc.
Yeah, absolutely, or people just not declaring them so the Germans didn't get their cut, as it were. Probably poor phrasing there when talking about pigs, but that was partly it. I mean, there was a massive problem with bread, coal, and oil were all in short supply, so electricity was a big issue because they were already cutting the electricity off. People had to adjust their day in terms of when they were doing things just because of lack of electricity supply. And, we're only a few months into the occupation here, it's not even a year, and this is really causing problems.
Yeah, about 20 years ago, we actually kept pigs on our land, and my neighbour's father asked if he could come over with his grandchildren to see the pigs. So this is Len Kreber, who's still with us, in his 90s, and he was telling me that he was aware of a pig that was being kept around about this time in the occupation, and it was coming up to the point where it had to be sent on to meet its maker. And there was a discussion about amongst those in the know about how does one dispatch this pig, because no one had a gun to sort of stick it would have created this awful shrieking, and no one really fancied doing that. So one of the guys volunteered to dispatch the pig with a pickaxe, but they said to him, "You've got one hit only."
Gosh.
And the guy apparently spent some time practicing on Swedes.
Okay, right. One way of doing it, I suppose.
Yeah. Well, I had heard many years ago about this was sort of common practice at the slaughterhouse, but one doesn't want to think too deeply into that. Anyway, the said pig was dispatched cleanly and efficiently, and everyone had a bloody good feed. So, so that's a tale from the source. And then I think you've got some other disgusting food alternatives here. Was it haricot bean paste or something?
Yeah, haricot bean paste. It was a reader's recipe which was sent in to the Guernsey press, giving it an idea of a little sandwich spread which you could create either sweet or savoury, which will suit all. You take cold haricot beans mashed, seasoned with lemon juice or to taste. As I had no lemon, I used raspberry essence and a little sugar for one half and Worcester sauce for the other. Quite a contrast, and as always, allows a scope for the individual taste. They used half a pint of haricot beans, soaked through for 24 hours, put them onto boil in a pinch of salt, and then simmered them for 2.5 to 3 hours, strained them through a colander into a basin, saving the stock, and then when cold, mashed them. And yeah, they put that in a sandwich. I'm not rushing out to go and recreate that.
No, but it's not. It's only a few steps removed from hummus, and that recipe might turn up in a Sunday supplement before too long.
Yeah.
All the hipsters will go for that.
My other half, Katie, is desperate to try some recipes. I'm not so desperate to actually taste them.
No, well, there has been some talk about resurrecting some of these recipes for the 80th anniversary of the Liberation next year.
Yeah.
Limpet pate, here we come.
Oh, dearie me! I've got to get out of jail free on that one. I can't eat shellfish, so thankfully. But it's on a serious note. Katie is thinking about trying some of these. So if you're lucky, I might bring you in a sample of something.
Fricassee of seagull. Okay, we move on from food. Also, now, of course, one of the main, if not the main, mode of transport was bicycles, and these cycles were now subject to theft.
Yeah, and I suspect it depends what you define theft as. Particularly this particular case that I found in the paper, although he was found guilty by Jurat Courtier-Lepelle. This chap, a 17-year-old labourer of Brock Cottage, Brock Road, St Sampson's, was charged with stealing by finding. Now, I've never heard of that phrase. No. So, stealing by finding between June the 19th, 1940 and January 1941. And it gives the address, and it's a gent's pedal cycle, etc. It seems he basically just took a bicycle that had been left behind, just abandoned by somebody when they went to be evacuated.
And that person was an Edwin Dodd, absent from the island.
Yeah, but somebody else said that they were responsible for Mr. Dodd's property. And so he'd apparently taken this bicycle. He was fined £1 with the alternative of 8 days in prison. So, yeah, there was that. And you very, very quickly found that Bill Green had opened a cycle shop in St. Peter where you could stable your bicycle. Bit like a horse stable, I suppose.
It was. And Bill Green was a much loved figure, obviously passed on now, lived out at Jerburg. And did we make a note of his book that came out?
It was called Guernsey Green.
Guernsey Green. So that book is still certainly available on the second-hand bookstore. Stalls here.
You can still get it on Amazon, I think, as well.
So he was a famous person, probably because of the war. But he was a great sportsman, I think, motor enthusiast.
He was, yeah.
So he had a cycle shop in St. Peter Port near at the top of Smith Street, and we think it was near the Coal Hole pub, which is called now.
It's the Prince. It's part of the Prince of Wales now.
Prince of Wales.
I don't think it's referred to as the Coal Hole anymore since it's been redeveloped.
So for people listening that know their St. Peter Port geography, so we think Bill's shop was at the top of Smith Street near the Prince of Wales pub. And so, yes, people were able to take their cycle there, lodge it with Bill for a few pennies. It was like taking a horse to the stables, except we didn't have to feed it, of course.
Yeah, and I suppose at least you knew it was going to be there when you came back.
Well, it was important because it was the only way of getting around.
Yeah, absolutely. And another interesting thing about Bill, you talked about Seaplane Bungalow at Jerburg. Well, there's a reason why it was called Seaplane Bungalow, because it was built out of bits of hangar from the World War I French flying boat base that was here. So one of the hangars down at the harbour here.
That was by the Model Yacht Pond, I think.
They actually built some of it in the Model Yacht Pond. It was drained.
Yes, that's right.
Built some in there.
And in fact, that squadron, we're digressing slightly, but that squadron in World War I, that was a French seaplane squadron, and it was a U-boat hunter, and it actually won the Croix de Guerre.
Did it? I didn't know that.
Yeah. So anyway, back to Bill.
Anyway, back to the right war.
Yeah.
not the earlier one.
The first half, so to speak, in football terms. Yeah, so in fact, Seaplane Cottage is still there in one form or another out at Jerburg. I think it's still in the Green family, possibly. And it's on the edge, all contained within Battery Strasbourg.
Yes, it is.
Yeah,
you're
with remarkable
right.
views over the island. Anyway, moving on. We also see an account here in the local paper. A 40-year-old farmer from the Forest Parish, and this is near the airport here on Guernsey, was fined 10 shillings for being out after curfew and a further 2 and 6 for not carrying his ID card. He was 200 yards from home and was attending to the carving of a cow. He was caught on the way home having attended to this booker. And you've actually found the actual case in the paper.
Yeah, I found it in one of my copies of the Guernsey Press.
And I want you to read the name of the farmer out, because it's a wonderful name.
Mansell Delisle, a 40-year-old farmer of Montplaisir Forest, was charged with infringing the curfew order at 12:30 a.m. on February the 1st, 1941, at the Forest Road. Further, with failing to carry his identity card at all times. He pleaded guilty to both charges, because clearly he was guilty. But the police inspector Sculper said it was an unusual case. One of his cattle was about to calve. He left his house in order to attend to the heifer some 200 yards away and was returning to the house when stopped. The inspector suggested, in view of the circumstances, that the defendant be treated more leniently than usual. The magistrate fined the defendant 10 shillings for the curfew and 2 shillings 6 for the identity card fraction. So he was treated more leniently than normal, and most of the other fines.
Yes, and that's very interesting. Yeah, very interesting, because I wonder if the magistrate, would have, if he had been minded not to fine him at all, whether the German authorities would have allowed that.
Yeah, I don't think they would have been very pleased about that.
No, so it sort of suggests a degree of autonomy, but I think always at the back that the Germans would have said, right, somebody has to be fined something.
Yeah, I mean, the magistrate would have been able to decide that he wasn't going to fine him, but there would have been implications.
Yeah, repercussions.
I doubt very much that case would have been reported in the paper, for starters.
Oh, yes, of course.
If that was the case, and the magistrates would have got a good talking to. Now, one of the things about this is they were really hot on identity cards once they issued them. There are numerous reminders in the paper throughout the occupation about the importance of carrying your identity card. You mustn't let it get dog-eared and tattered, etc., etc. The Germans were obsessed with that. So it's all about them having control and stuff. I mean, I read in an unpublished diary the other day that in February 41, on one day alone, the commandant issued 40 instructions to either the government or to the local population just in one day. Some of them were a bit odd as well, but we'll cover those another time.
I still have my grandmother's identity card, and it's still in good shape. I take it along my Guernsey walking tours, so there's quite a few of them kicking around, aren't there?
Yeah, they're
originals.
Yeah, mostly because people did actually look after them. If you're tempted to buy one off the internet, I'd be very wary, because a lot of those are fakes. Yeah. But there we go.
But in fact, after the war, people still had to carry identity cards, not German ones, but UK-issued ones, because I've still got those.
Yeah.
I think they might have been tied into rationing as well.
Yeah, I think that was all to do with rationing. So it was until mid-50s, wasn't it?
Yeah. Okay, another interesting thing I picked up was the German Strength Through Joy organisation, which was a propaganda entertainment unit, sent artists to Guernsey to entertain the troops and civilians at the Regal Cinema. And we were unable to turn anything up particular to this date, but I think later on you have something.
Yeah, I've got plenty of evidence of that later on in the war, but I couldn't turn anything up for February. But it must have been in the Guernsey Press. It's just that I don't have a copy of one of the ones.
Have we got a flavour for what they actually did? Was it must have been some sort of cabaret? Or
yeah, it tended to be sort of cabaret type events. There were some quite famous German artists at the time that came here.
Right, yeah.
Particularly later on in the war and immediately before.
So it would have been a sort of Ensa review type.
Yeah, that kind of thing. But there's a lady whose name eludes me for the moment, but she was known as the Lady in White. And there's actually a thing up at the Occupation Museum here in Guernsey. Yes. A little write-up about her. But she was quite famous at the time in Germany, and she came here to entertain. They were big on their military bands. They were big on that as well, particularly earlier on in the occupation when they were trying to proved that they weren't that bad after all, etc.
The Charm Offensive.
Yeah, band concerts up in Candy Gardens and things like that.
Lots of pictures of that already.
Yeah, there are loads of pictures. There's loads of pictures of marching bands marching through St. Peter's Port.
Well, that's the iconic picture, isn't it, of them walking up from the Pollet in front of
Lloyd's Bank, yeah.
Yeah, because there is this two-picture thing, isn't there? There was an old gentleman watching them, where in some of the pictures, he's got his hands by his side, and another picture where he actually appears to be saluting. And this was the one where he appears to be saluting. There was a question of that somehow he was paying homage to the Germans, when in fact someone suggested, no, he may have been a military man, i.e. from the First World War, and he was simply saluting the military rank, not necessarily the enemy. Have you come across that at all?
I've not read about that, to be fair.
Have you seen the two photographs?
I have seen the two photographs, yeah. And there's plenty of others as well. There are ones from outside what was the Channel Hotel and along where the Savoy used to be. So for anybody who's not familiar with either of those places, we're talking along the North Esplanade there, along where the Marina Court and the Financial Services Commission.
On the way to Salary Corner.
Heading towards Salary Corner. And also down where the taxi rank is now as well. I've seen some photographs of a German band playing there. But that was the sort of thing. But yeah, they were sort of cabaret review type things of little interest to locals, to be fair, because they were in German. So unless you had an understanding of German, you weren't going to really get very far.
German umpire music is not. This is a music for being threatened by, I think, on cultural grounds as entertainment. Okay, and then we see this, the Labour Office were appealing for discarded but still usable Wellington boots for women workers, so that the ladies were being invited into the fields, by the sounds of it, for needing Wellington boots.
Yeah, they were running out of enough people to do work, so the women were actually being dragged into working in the fields as well. Interesting on rubber in particular, the Germans were short of rubber throughout, pretty much throughout the war. And one of the things that happened in February 41 was that if you still lucky enough still to have a car but were not using it because you couldn't get petrol, they sent an order which meant that you had to jack your car up and take the tyres off, and they were coming around taking away tyres or any other unused rubber products not being used in, tyres on bicycles were fine. But if you had any other rubber products, the Germans were after them, presumably to take back to Germany. And
yes, because rubber was one of those commodities. Of course, the Japanese moved against, I think, in Burma and Malaya, the rubber plantations. So there was a worldwide shortage of rubber. Okay, we also now see that a report that Guernsey workers based on Alderney were now producing their own news sheet and were running a communal farm with pigs, cows, horse and ponies, and presumably, I don't know who this news sheet would have been for. I asked if you had one. You don't, but they probably don't exist at all now. But it seems such the strangest thing to do, to this group of men who could probably spoke to each other each day producing a news sheet.
Yeah, I think it was probably more a news sheet of what was going on, from listening to the BBC or something. But it still seems a little bit odd, given that it was a smallish group of people up there. But
yeah, I'm surprised. Maybe the libraries would have had one, but strange thing. Also, a report that rabbits were for sale at an address in the Bordage in St. Peter Port. So this is where rabbits were being farmed, I suppose, and bred for meat.
Yeah, people were doing that on a regular basis. There were a lot of people, if they had the ability to keep animals, they, even small animals like rabbits, then they were doing that because you couldn't go out hunting them because you didn't have anything to hunt rabbits with. So it had to be a case of they were effectively breeding rabbits for this. Only the Germans were able to go rabbit hunting.
Well, rabbit hunting in Herm, I think, was the big thing.
That was a day out for them. Yeah,
My mother, who was in London throughout the Blitz and throughout the war, told me she remembered a V2 coming down a couple of streets away and causing havoc. And she said, there were one poor woman who was dead hanging out of a window, and she said it was made more bizarre by all these white rabbits running around. So somebody in the middle of London was was breeding rabbits for meat at the same time.
Yeah,
They got out and were running willy-nilly amongst all the rescue workers. Moving away from food, or the lack of it, we have this report here in the Reverend Ord's diary for February 1941. RAF raids have claimed some German casualties. Ord reports the number of coffins being made by Lovells. So Ord, being a member of the clergy, was sort of locked into providing funerals, etc., and was on obviously on regular speaking terms with carpenters and undertakers. One of the things he was saying that officers had wooden, let's say elaborate coffins, certainly more than serviceable coffins, but the other ranks had to make do with what he calls plain Jane. And then I think you've come in with an account of a raid at that time.
Yeah, it's probably the one that Ord refers to. It was Saturday the 8th of February 1941, where a chap who was actually a civil servant refers to gunfire at 4 planes on his way into St. Peter Port at about 10 a.m. No sirens had sounded, so I kept on cycling, thinking I would be safe or that it was just gun practice. At the salary, I was asked to dismount and take cover, and he could hear bits of shrapnel and things falling down, because one mustn't forget that what goes up must come down. So even if the British weren't bombing anything, you were still at risk from bits of shell, shrapnel and things like that from the flak guns, of which there were plenty around the harbour, for bits of those coming down and potentially injuring or killing you. So you had to be careful from that point of view. Now, there's also a report that the same diarist reports a few days later that he's told in his office. Now, I'm not sure which office of the states he actually works for at this point, but I will find out. He's told in his office that 20 Germans were killed in machine gunning by the British aircraft.
Is this likely? So many?
It seems like a lot, because I don't recall
that many being killed on any one single day.
But again, yeah, exactly. We've got a list of the deaths. There's not that many on one day. But again, it's the rumours that circulate due to lack of real hard information.
Yeah, and this is where we, as we I think do occasionally, while we're pleased that there are many, many diaries in circulation, which is to say been published or republished, some differ greatly from others in veracity, but we know that the Reverend Ord was well connected. Certainly German speaker, and German officers and other ranks visited his church at Ebenezer and Brock Road. So he's perhaps one of the more reliable ones, isn't he?
Yeah, I mean, you can't blame the other ones. They're
no.
They're recording what they've been told, but of course, unless they've witnessed it firsthand, you've got to be a little bit skeptical. Even if they've witnessed it firsthand, it depends when they wrote the diary. Did they write it after the war?
Yeah, exactly.
Did they write it at the time as things were going on? Well, there's a whole heap of questions around that. But it's just, I find it really interesting just to compare what people have been saying.
In fact, in some ways, we'll do that right now, because the item that we've just been talking about was related to us. We extracted it from the Reverend Ord's diary. We move on now to an account from Ralph Durand's diary. Ralph Durand was head of Priaulx Library during the war, and he wrote a diary which was published very soon after the war. In fact, he succumbed to malnutrition in 1946, I think, very, very soon after the war, within 12 months.
Yeah, he died before the book was published.
Yes. And so just to say, we do delve into those books as well. What we've extracted from Durand in February 1941, a party of 15 Frenchmen who escaped from France landed on Guernsey thinking it was the UK and were sent back to France. So, Nick, over to you on this.
Yeah, this is quite a sad story, actually. They'd escaped from France. They'd been beset with bad weather, which destroyed their navigational equipment. And when they eventually sighted land, which was Varzon Bay over on the west coast of Guernsey, so they'd actually got all the way around to the west coast. So they're on the other side of the island from
in the channel,
France,
so to speak, between us and England, as opposed between the Channel Islands and France.
So they sighted Varzon Bay, thought it was the Isle of Wight, and I have no idea if this bit is true, but they were reputed to be jubilantly singing La Marseillaise. I'm not sure if that bit's true, but that's one of the rumours that goes around. They certainly did land at Varzon. They were sent to Jersey, where 3 of them were sentenced to death. In the event, only one of them, who was deemed to be the ringleader, a chap called Francois Scornet, was executed. He was shot at St. Juan's Manor in Jersey. And he had been inspired by a broadcast by exiled French leader General Charles de Gaulle in 1940, and that's why he wanted to set sail on an open boat with these guys from Brittany, aiming to reach England and join the Free French. But there's some particularly horrible aspects to this. His parents were sent for to witness his execution.
So they got hold, because the young men had left, hadn't told their parents or anything. They were leaving.
No, they hadn't. No. So yeah, the Germans actually brought his parents from Brittany to watch him be executed. I just think that's horrific. That was just they were put before firing squad. Well, sorry, he was put before the firing squad for willfully supporting England in the war against the German Empire. He was allowed to write a final letter to his parents, I believe, and he finished it with, "I believe the end of my existence has come. I will die for France, bravely facing the enemy." So yeah, that's a particularly sad story. The other 2 that were sentenced to death were not shot in the end. They ended up in prison instead.
But Scornet was buried initially then in St Helier in Jersey. Then, following liberation, his remains were exhumed and his remains were returned to France.
Yes, they were. Yeah.
Yes, that's a particularly sad story, that, and I think there are photographs in some of the books of, it was I feel, there, and before and after photographs of the site. But yeah, I mean, he stood forward and said, "I'm the ringleader." I think he was quite young. He was one of the youngest in the group, wasn't he?
He was quite young. I think I've got a feeling he was 21, but I might be wrong.
Yeah. Okay, so moving on from there, we've got this item here, Nick, about posting in the mail for the continent.
Yeah. So I hadn't thought about this before, to be fair, and it was something that I just assumed it was just the Red Cross messages that had been possible, but actually it wasn't. So it was possible to post mail to the continent. Now, by the continent, we are not talking the entire European continent. It's basically anywhere that's occupied by the Germans or allied to the Germans. So you could send stuff to Germany, Italy, Belgium, and occupied France. You had to hand it into the Kommandantur for dispatch, so the Germans could censor things, obviously, and it gave the postage rates there as well. I'm guessing that was primarily for the Germans, but I have seen accounts that others have posted things to people, presumably to Guernsey people that were sent to France, so that they weren't completely.
Well, yeah, also, I suppose, when you think more deeply, there were organisation Todd people that could have been writing back to their...
Yeah,
and possibly even the ladies of pleasure writing back to their families.
Potentially, yes, the French ladies that were brought over.
But it's interesting to see that, well, even to consider the fact that if you had a pen pal in Belgium from before the war, conceivably, you could still write to them.
You could have potentially still been writing to them, yeah. One of the things that I think I've touched on before is, of course, that the local paper was controlled by the Germans. The front page was all basically German propaganda, and that's widely acknowledged that most people paid not a bit of difference to it. I was reading something the other day, again in this unpublished diary, and I thought it had summed it up quite nicely, actually. So, bearing in mind that the Kommandantur was in Grange Lodge, the diarist notes, no real news in the papers. Newspapers may as well be called the Grange Lodge Times. Not even 1 in 10 believe the front page. The rest is adverts, golden weddings, and the police court, which is fairly accurate summation of what goes into the paper in those times. or
even today.
Yeah, well, there's a little bit more in there today, but they only had 4 pages at most points during the occupation. It was the paper changes sizes, both in number of pages and actual format of the paper, the size of the paper itself. It goes from broadsheet down to much smaller, but still only 4 pages. Or sometimes there were more pages printed, but both of the papers were like that, and they were printed. At some points, they were printed on alternate days because they didn't have enough paper, etc., to print more. But they are really interesting just to see some of the adverts that were in there. Gives you context on how desperate people were for some items.
Have you got any examples there? I know what you mean. The sort of people that were prepared to, a pound of sugar for a set of dentures or something.
Yeah, no, there was a lot of bartering and things like that going on. But yeah, you see all these adverts. I just find them really, really, really interesting. And then you've got, of course, the readers' recipes like the haricot paste that we've just talked about. There's no end of those because people were writing into the paper with that because they were trying to help. They'd experimented with making some sort of substitute food because they couldn't get something else. And if it sort of vaguely worked, then they'd write in and tell everybody so that, people more widely around the islands could find out. Because bear in mind, some people, one of the people whose diaries I've read who lived in town has said that he didn't think he walked more than 3 miles circumference of where he lived for the entire occupation.
Yes, that's quite incredible. It's not as if you could go down to the beach or anything, really, could it?
No, exactly.
And people were exhausted. But before I forget, and I'm going to tell you something now that you don't know, is when I took a walking tour yesterday, a lady came up to me and said, because she heard me talking about Islands at War podcast, and she said, my father worked for the Guernsey press during the Second World War, and she showed me a lot of the paperwork that she'd retained, including postage stamps, reams of postage stamps and notes he'd made. He died in 1968, and she said, "Are this any interest to you and your friend on the radio?" And I said, "Too right it is." And she showed me some photographs she had on her phone anyway, and there's a little treasure trove that we've been invited to cast our eyes over.
Excellent. That'll be really interesting. That can provide some great stuff for this, I would imagine.
Well, there was a wonderful picture. I worked at the Guernsey Press 30 years ago, and she showed me a picture of the staff photograph from the war, and I remember seeing that in the boardroom myself. So I thought I would share that live on air with you.
Ah, interesting.
And she said, "Well, it's only me interested. What will I do, when I'm gone?" I said, "You need to get that to the Guernsey archives, but we'd like to have a look at it first."
Yeah, absolutely. They'd be delighted to have that, I'm sure.
So I'm sure that we'll be able to share some photographs of that in the forthcoming weeks.
Yeah. I mean, the having said about the front page of the paper being all propaganda, some of it is quite entertaining because if you sat in 2024 and what was actually going on in the campaign that they're reporting on, it's usually the exact opposite of what the actual events were. So it is quite interesting, but it made people here very worried because they were regularly printing things saying that London is in ashes, and that people are fleeing to the countryside, because of this, because so many people are being killed in the bombing, and so it was awfully worrying for them.
But people have their radios still at this point. They had been returned to them. Yes, they had been returned to them weeks before. So
February they were okay. So but it still sowed the seed of doubt.
Of course,
are the BBC not telling us because it's bad for morale, that kind of thing? But the Germans put some quite odd things in the press, particularly I don't know why they put them on the front page. I guess there wasn't enough propaganda to fill the front page, but it'd be like a tour through Germany, and it had just have a couple of paragraphs and a picture of a German cathedral or a German lake and stuff like that. It's just very odd.
Well, I think it's probably trying to make us feel inclusive or included within the Third Reich.
Yeah, maybe.
Okay, so I'm sure we'll get plenty more in the Guernsey press as we move through the months ahead. gunfire practice. Did you want to have a...
Yeah, this is another interesting one that I turned up the other week, and a particular interest to me because I live near Delancey Park, which the road that runs down to the seafront is called Delancey Lane. This diarist, well, there's a couple of aspects to this. We'll come back to the first bit of what they say in a moment because that runs into the next thing we're going to talk about after this. But for those of you familiar with St. Peterport Harbour, there's the lighthouse on the end of, some people call it a pier.
It's a breakwater.
Breakwater. 1940s terminology for these things seems to have been a mole. A bit like Dunkirk and the mole there. Anyway, but at the end of the breakwater there, the Germans had set up some guns. I think they were 2-centimetre guns, and they decided that they were going to have a bit of gun practice and pointed them at the rocks off of the Salary. Actually, they were kind of nearer. They were aiming at the ones that are opposite the entrance to Delancey Lane, so not that far from the Co-op. If you're familiar with that locale, they were shooting at those big lumps of granite, which obviously was a fairly dangerous thing to do because you could have had ricochets going into Delancey Lane, all the houses along there, things like that. Now, quite often the Germans made people move when they were doing gunfire practice, but I haven't seen any mention of that in this case, but I'm sure they must have done. But there we go. But the other interesting bit from that article is the diarist says they're trying to solve reports of parachutists and the detention of 2 maids. We'll come on to that in a mo.
You've also got here the fisherman and the submarine.
Yeah, now we were talking about this before we started recording, and you'd also heard this rumour. Now this is in a diary that was written at the time, and it's the 25th of February. Again, this is an unpublished diary, so nobody, very few people are going to have seen this. But there were rumours going around that 2 fishermen were hailed by a British submarine a few days ago. The commander made inquiries as to conditions in Guernsey and offered the men a passage to England, but they declined because their wives were still on the island. Now, when we were talking before we started, you said you'd heard this rumour as well. Yes. And I'd heard it. So it obviously still carries on today. When people are talking about the occupation, this rumour still gets around. But it's interesting to see that it was actually written down at the time by somebody writing a diary.
Not only written down, but it's all been typed up. This is a typed up diary.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's typed.
Yeah.
He also talks about British planes, long streaks of vapour circling the harbour and the airport shortly after noon, 12:30 German time. 9 or 10 rounds were fired at her from the Corbière neighbourhood, but without any effect by the looks of it.
Yeah, there's also here for the entry for the 8th of February. I was going to say several mines hauled up on the beach at Lalonde near Fort Doyle exploded yesterday, killing an officer and 4 or 5. Has that been corroborated?
I haven't looked to see on that. I did wonder if it was mixed up with the incident down at Grand Havre, but I will check. I'll come back to that one.
Yeah, it's worth having a look because we haven't got a list of the German dates, and if they all died on the same day, again, from memory,
I can check that while we're
few
talking.
Times that more than a handful of Germans were killed on the same day. Yeah, so your access to this is. It's wonderful. I'll say it's a typewritten diary. Okay, where are we going next?
Should we go talk about parachutists and
yes, please.
And problems with
always a good story where parachutists are involved.
Well, this is So this was mentioned, as I said, in the very first bit of the diary that we were talking about just before, and it's an interesting one because we talked about the fact that. In the past, that people wanted to wind up the Germans from time to time and things like that, and that the Germans did in fact make themselves look particularly stupid on some occasions because of some of these things. This is no exception. Now, let's start with the parachutists. Rumours were going around that parachutists had landed in the island and had been circulating for a number of days. Now, that's quite believable at this point because, we've had the commando raids. The Germans were furious. There's been a lot of that. They made them recreate the commando raids that, where they caught them. So that they had to recreate it. So quite believable, I suppose, that, parachutists were potentially in the island. Although I would say that the chances of landing anybody accurately with the parachute from that time period or anywhere near the island without getting wet feet.
But the Germans were probably the foremost exponents of parachute warfare, and they probably felt that what they could do, the Allies conceivably could, or the English could conceivably do, so they would have taken it very seriously.
Yeah, potentially. Anyway, so then things move on, and there are reports of two maid girls meeting two men in Cambridge Park and talking to them.
This is just outside St. Peter Port.
Yeah, just outside St. Peter Port. It's a park. Now, if you were going to meet somebody clandestinely, I'm not sure Cambridge Park is where I'd pick.
No.
It's basically a big wide open space with some trees down one side.
Yeah. And with many German officers stationed, billeted near there.
Yeah, there were a lot of them billeted in the massive hotel on the corner there with a lovely view out over the park. Anyway, so these two girls were allegedly also then caught signalling with a bicycle lamp from the top 2 floors of Ivy Gates, which was the Sherbrooks house. And when questioned, the girls claimed to be signalling to the Tommies and told the Germans they were meeting the parachutists in Cambridge Park to give them food and water. Now, that's interesting, but there's more to this, because the Germans became convinced then that there were parachutists. These two maids were only, I think, 15 and 16. They weren't very, very old. They were locked up. But this is the same incident that resulted in a guard being placed on the Sherbrooks and Mrs. Kinnersley up at Ivy Gates. And the Germans basically got people to hide in the bushes to try and see if they could catch these people being signalled to. So they made one of the girls go back and start signalling and stuff, and basically to act as a decoy. So the Germans were convinced about this for absolutely ages, and just wasted an awful lot of time. They even sent one of the girls to Cambridge Park to go and wander around and supposedly meet these Tommies. It caused an awful lot of hassle.
So the Germans believed that a number of English parachutists had arrived and had hidden themselves amongst the population.
Yeah, and let's face it, we had form for that, because that's exactly what happened with the commandos. So plausible. it was plausible. But it turned out that one of the girls, Doris Gill, aged 17, did it all for a joke. She began it by throwing an anonymous letter in a German officer's car, saying that Mrs. Sherbrooke was a secret agent and a British spy, and that the house should be watched. They actually searched the room of Doris Gill and found a photograph of her sitting on a German's knee with her arms around her neck. So she apparently, the diarist records that she seems a bit dotty, and they say she has seen too many films.
Yes, seen too many films.
She broke down under German examination and confessed everything. They're still detaining her. The other girl is completely innocent. So the Germans were still not convinced, though, so they carried on their inquiries for quite some time. This does run into March, so we'll probably talk about that then. But it does highlight that it could be a very dangerous game, even just doing something ostensibly as a practical joke could have severe impacts on other people, let alone yourself.
Well, yes, it becomes a runaway train, doesn't it? And it's the sort of thing that if you had, and I know this has been done, but if you were to make a TV series about the occupation, there was one, I think, called, was it called Islands at War?
Yep, there was. There was indeed.
About probably 25 years ago. But you can imagine this would have been an episode, like with a start and a finish. But it's a real life story, and it carries on, as you say, into March of 1941. but it's severely involving innocent people with the Gestapo.
Yeah, absolutely. The German field police had a field day, but they wasted an awful lot of time, just trying to apprehend these so-called parachutists. But the rumour was rife around the island as well before, so one of the Germans must have said something, or these girls had said something, that to other people for this rumour to even get around.
Well, it's the sort of thing that people wanted to believe it in a way, isn't it?
Yeah, probably.
And and it's tied very much to the fact that there's an absence of real news in the newspaper. So this sort of rumour is going to circulate like wildfire.
Oh yeah, there were so many different rumours, and as we've said before, Reverend Ord is quite sceptical about rumours. So he's usually a pretty good source, because he'll record the fact that somebody's told him a rumour, and then a couple of days later he'll either say, well, it turns out it seems to be true, or no, actually it was a load of rubbish. So,
yeah.
But yeah, say that story kind of goes on into
March, and we'll follow up on the next the next month by month.
Yeah,
episode.
exactly. That story also kind of reminds me about something that happened at the same time, which was in January and February. They made late January, early February, they made themselves look really stupid, because they were guarding that home built plane that we talked about, which was in an attic. Couldn't possibly have been. In fact, that crashed when it first. The one and only time that they tried to fly it at Varzon.
This is the
pre-war. The sort of
this was the one lodged in a building at the top of St Julian's Avenue.
It was in Motorhouse. Yeah,
Motorhouse.
Yeah,
it was
in the attic. But the poor bloke who was the manager of the garage still got sent to prison for it, even for not reporting that it was.
And it's the bits of an aeroplane, really.
Yeah,
it wasn't like an aeroplane sat upstairs in a loft.
No, it was like about 15 feet long or something like that. It's absolutely tiny. But it actually crashed when the one and only time I believe that it flew was down at Varzon along the beach there, and got about 100 feet up in the air, and then promptly descended rather rapidly and crashed. So it was.
And this was before the war.
This was before the war, yeah. So, but they went, they posted guards, and it all got very serious, and all sorts of stuff, and they just became a bit of a laughing stock, because everybody thought it was, the inordinate amount of manpower that they were putting on these things.
Yeah, and I just going back to where you were talking about cars being put on blocks and the tyres removed because the Germans wanted to gather all the rubber. I mean, I certainly remember when I was delivering newspapers locally as a schoolboy in the 60s, every now and again a photograph would turn up of someone discovering a pre-World War II car that had been secreted in a shed somewhere, and tomato trays or things draped all around it to hide it. And these things were sort of forgotten, the places overgrew, and then years later people found them, revealed these wonderful cars.
Yeah, some of them turned up on Liberation Day as well.
You mean they've been renovated? And
no, actually turned up on.
I see what you mean. On the actual liberation. Yes, they were suddenly liberated. Yes.
With people knowing that liberation was about to happen, some of them did, prepare their cars to put them back on the road, and had obtained or kept a small amount of petrol for that purpose.
Well, there were some that did sort of come to light. That people must have died and forgotten and never told anybody they were there.
Yeah.
Eventually, people hacked their way through the undergrowth, found these sheds, and found cars inside.
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me.
Time capsules, and from when I was seeing this in the 20s, you're not too far away from the war. But now, I doubt very much if anyone's going to find anything. I think if Richard Guillaume's people haven't found it, then it's not there to be found.
It would. Chances are it would have rotted away by now as well.
Okay, so any other items to look out at this week?
Shall we talk about a slightly odd one?
Go on. You want to.
I know. I found this, and I just thought this is worth a bit of a look. This is about a Canadian who was found guilty, and it certainly must have been a lot of interest in this court case, because it spanned the whole of the front page and pretty much the whole of the back page on February the 3rd, 1941. This was a chap called Benjamin Brunt. Now, he was a chiropractor, or claimed to be a chiropractor. Whether he was or not, really not quite sure. What he certainly wasn't was a doctor, which is how he got himself into a lot of bother. So this chap claimed, and there's numerous aspects of this court case which I find odd, but we'll see. Let's see what you all think. So he turned up in Guernsey in May 1940. Allegedly, he was here to purchase some cattle to take back to Canada. Oddly, for somebody who was supposedly doing that, he hired some rooms in Smith Street to practice as a chiropractor, but then seemed to turn into practicing as a doctor, but without being registered with the local authorities here or anything like that. And he was basically palming people off with herbal medicine or doing some very strange things, including visiting somebody who was very ill in a nursing home. And what I think this is partly why he got caught was either people complained that, strangely enough, his replacing a diabetic's insulin with his own herbal medicine at a cost of £1 a time was
snake oil.
Yeah, was not going to work. So that's like 25 quid in today's money. Was perhaps not a good idea. He also prescribed massages for cancer and things like that. So he got himself into a whole heap of bother. He didn't speak and wasn't called by his lawyer at all during the court case. The bailiff who was presiding was deeply unimpressed by this gentleman's behaviour, and he decided, this is not really acceptable behaviour. The guy had used the excuse that he didn't know that the laws here were different. He said he wasn't practicing as a doctor. He was just a friend of all these people, and he was giving them this stuff. But unfortunately for him, they all testified that he was actually charging, with the exception of one. So yeah, a very strange case. I'm just trying to find what the bailiff said. Here we go. I'm rather of the opinion it should be headed as one conviction, and the fine today should not exceed £20, which is the amount he was actually fined, which was the maximum that could be imposed in that case. He said, I place no reliance on Mr. Martel's plea on behalf of the defendant that he was ignorant of the island laws. When he arrived here, he should have known that a dependency such as this differs in jurisdiction from the mainland. The court decided by majority to treat the case as one conviction and not three separate infractions, because they were originally going to try him as three things. So he ended up having to pay £20 and £16 of costs as well. But yeah, he was.
So what happened to him? Because he wouldn't have been Canadian. He wasn't neutral.
No, at that point the Germans hadn't deported anybody for their nationality. So I don't know what happened to him after that.
Okay, so that's
another one to look at.
Another one to
find out whether he got deported or not.
Well, maybe it looks like I'll just say for the listeners, it's possible because Nick's going on to a wonderful place next week. Do you want to have a little quick word about? We've only got a few minutes, but We Have Ways.
I'm off to the We Have Ways festival, which is, if you listen to the We Have Ways podcast, you'll know what that's all about, but it's all about World War II, and it's 1944 is the theme this year, so I'm really looking forward to that. Loads of historians there.
So, and they have a podcast, of course.
Yeah, they do, yeah. If you just look up We Have Ways of Making You Talk, that you will find that with Al Murray and James Holland.
Thoroughly recommended. So when Nick does that, it's possible that there'll be a little special with myself and Steve Foote about the books that Steve has published about World War II, and some advanced news on John Little's new diaries that are coming out. It's the Van... How do you pronounce Van?
I can't pronounce it.
No. Okay. It's a German officer's diaries. More news on that to come. In the meantime, this podcast is brought to you by Gnet Radio, and you can follow up on our music shows at www.gnetradio.com. There is a musical supplement to this show. It's called Rough and Rowdy Times, and has music from the 1920s up to the Cuban Missile Crisis, which I thought was a good cut-off point. as we were nearly all cut off ourselves. Well, certainly I'm old enough to have been cut off at that point. And also we have a new podcast on Gnet Radio, 3 Men in a Shed, which is all things musically related. And there's also a 3 Men in a Shed Spotify list that will accompany each pod there. And that goes out fortnightly. So the first one is now available. So what we're going to do is wish Nick a wonderful, wonderful time. And you'll update us when we do a little bit of March 1941.
Indeed.
Okay, so thanks to everybody that continues to support us. And it's bye from myself, Keith, and...
Bye from myself, Nick Lehre. Bye.
Okay, and we'll have a little bit of Jim to play us out.
He looked to the heavens when he heard the engines hum. A sky full of planes and each one with a bomb. And they're gonna wanna drop them on someone. It's 5 to 7. All his friends and family had gone. Left on a ship 'cause they knew what was to come.
Bye-bye.